So you have a presentation for us
Yes,
about science fiction changing the world and affecting our present and future and all that crazy stuff. Nice.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, let's check it out.
So this first slide is just a collection of various science fiction covers. So it's book covers and movie covers and so forth. A collection of things that I really like that I think have been really influential. For example, how we think about alien invasion really comes a lot from War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is one of the covers there.
Right.
Yeah, so Quantum Leap and Stranger in a Strange Land. Stranger in a Strange Land had a huge influence on people's romantic relationships through the 60s. It was a very popular book, a ridiculously popular book that we don't talk about much anymore, but at the time it had a huge influence. So if you're going to talk about science fiction and how science fiction has influenced science and technology and modern culture, you've got to start with Star Trek. You absolutely have to start with Star Trek. And William Shatner wrote a terrible book, a book called I'm Working on That, which is his view of how Star Trek has influenced science and technology. It's given us flip phones, which are no longer part of the future. They're now very much part of our past.
Right.
They're flip phone. Like if you see somebody with a flip phone, you're like, is that rotary?
Yeah, exactly.
And tablets are really tricorders. Smartphones, to a certain extent, are tricorders.
Right.
I expect within 20 years, our smartphones will actually be able to read off biological data and be able to tell us whether or not we're dead.
Wow. Wow.
And it'll probably even have something that says, "He's dead, Jim," right on the smartphone.
So we could essentially call the science fiction genre science prediction?
Science prediction, you could.
Yeah.
You could. And there have been some fascinating ways in which science fiction has accidentally gotten things right. So early 18th and mid 18th century, Jonathan Swift and later Voltaire predicted that Mars had 2 moons. Nobody had seen these through telescopes. This was just something that they were like, oh yeah, 2 moons, why not? And they happened to get it right.
Wow.
It just coincidence. And if you think about it, it's not that weird because there's just all these books making all these statements. And if you just pick out the ones where, oh, this happened to be right and this happened to be right, it looks really wonky.
Yeah, no kidding.
So H.G. Wells, in 1914, wrote a book called The World Set Free, where he predicted atomic ruin. He actually predicted atomic bombs. Even the shape of the mushroom cloud was something he was able to come up with back in 1914, 31 years before atomic bombs were actually built. But what was amazing about H.G. Wells is not only did he predict this atomic bomb, he actually predicted World War II. He specifically predicted that Germany would go in and invade Poland, and the entire unfolding of World War II was something that H.G. Wells just sat down and was like, yeah, I think that's going to happen. So he didn't just predict the science of things, he also predicted a lot of the social sciences, the way people interacted and how people interacted.
Oh, wow.
So it's really amazing the prophetic ability of H.G. Wells. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Now you were also asking.
Yeah, has it changed like our relationship and how we feel about science now?
Absolutely. There was a wonderful book that came out, next slide please, called The Island of Dr. Moreau, which in a lot of ways, this is from the cartoon, the comic book version of The Island of Dr. Moreau, but it was originally a book, and it's a wonderful movie as well. And in The Island of Dr. Moreau, we start getting this idea of science fiction exploring what is life, what is the meaning of life, what right do we have to meddle with life? And this is still going on in the modern debates about genetically modified organisms, GMO crops. And this is a really hot button issue. And I claim that the way that we think about these issues is both influenced and expressed through story. So when we tell a story, when we read a story, these stories are talking about how we really feel subconsciously without even bringing it to our conscious mind. Now, The Island of Dr. Moreau is a very old story, but we have a more recent movie called Jurassic Park, and while it's really cool just to watch it from the standpoint of velociraptors, because velociraptors,
yeah, absolutely,
hey,
exactly,
totally. But but especially if you go back and read the book, and in the first iteration, Ian Malcolm's character within Jurassic Park is a very anti-science scientist, where he's talking about this idea that we are letting the cat out of the bag, and we need to put the cat back in the bag. And his misinterpretation of chaos theory is very much a real branch of mathematics and physics, but the way it's used in this is totally science fiction. Totally science fiction. That's not what chaos theory does. If you want chaos theory, James Gleick has an excellent book called Chaos, came out in 1987-ish. So there's wonderful science within that, and it gets misapplied in things like Jurassic Park. So I think our feelings about genetically modified organisms are very much influenced by science fiction. Now, going at it from a completely different direction, there was a wonderful short story in If magazine called A Feeling of Power, written by Isaac Asimov, and I've got another one from Isaac Asimov as well. And he predicts a time in the future, back in 1958, before pocket calculators are a thing, that not only are pocket calculators going to exist, but computers are going to be so widespread, and humans would rely on computers so deeply, we will forget how to add, subtract, multiply, divide. We won't even be able to balance a checkbook without a calculator. And he predicts this in 1958.
I think we're going in that direction.
Yeah.
I think it's happening.
And the character in this story, Schumann, actually teaches himself how to multiply and divide and add and subtract as sort of a party trick, like it's a hobby. He takes up math as a hobby. And this becomes a state secret, a military secret, where the military's like, oh my God, you could actually do the same calculations that a computer could. You're expendable. So they stick these people that Schumann trains onto missiles to guide the missiles because they're cheaper than computers. It's a very dystopic view of the future. Now, it should be noted that Dr. Asimov actually had a doctorate in biochemistry. He was straight up a real honest-to-God scientist. And a lot of science fiction writers are like this. Robert Heinlein had training as an engineer. Isaac Asimov, the good doctor. So there's a fair amount of communication between the science fiction world and the science world. And a lot of scientists are thrilled to talk to science fiction writers. And a lot of science fiction writers, Canadians, the great Canadian science fiction writer, Robert Sawyer, he and I have actually had long conversations. And he's talked to a lot of other far more important physicists than I am about various things within what's real, what's now, and what can I turn into a good story that'll get people excited about science, the way I got excited about it. My favorite, though, and I've really got to mention this, almost nobody today has heard of Murray Leinster, the dean of science fiction from the 1940s. In a story called A Logic Named Joe, he predicts these things that he calls logics, which if you read it is very just clearly an interconnected home computer. And the Carson circuit that he talks about allows these desktop devices to be communicating with all the other desktop devices in the world. 1946, he's predicting this. The tanks are computer screens and hard drives. He predicts a messaging service where people can type in a message and it appears in someone else's home. He then predicts a location and information services where someone's ex can track them down whether or not you want them to. Facebook. Stock prices become internationally available. Day trading of stocks get predicted. He then predicts an encyclopedia freely available for everyone in the world. Whoa. And students use it to cheat on their homework. Whoa. He predicts this in 1946.
That's incredible.
He then predicts computerized video phone calls and television shows that you can watch whenever you want, regardless of how many years ago it airs. So he even predicts YouTube. He does this all in 2 paragraphs because he's really just setting up the murder mystery. So the big question that people like to ask me as a scientist, is science good or evil? And the answer is neither. Science is a tool. It is a tool of humanity. And I want to talk, quote from The Crack of Doom by Robert Cromie, which first predicted the atomic bomb, although not nearly in the detail that H.G. Wells did 20 years later. The main character, Brandy, says, "There are no limits. No man can say to science, thus far, no farther. No man ever has been able to do so. No man ever shall." And we get uncomfortable. Every time there's a new scientific advance, old fogies like me wind up getting really, really uncomfortable with what the kids today are doing. I can't believe you're texting. And the next generation are going to come up with, oh, I can't believe you're getting those deliberate genetic modifications to your body. We never did that when I was a kid. And people will continue to have these really uncomfortable reactions every time there's new technology, and will use it anyways, because we always do. There's this myth, this completely incorrect view of science, that I, as a scientist, am working alone in a lab or alone in my office, and I make a sudden huge breakthrough. I yell, "Eureka!" and I run through the halls of my university going, "I found it, I found it, I found it." And that changes the world for a bit, but I'm the only person who understands it, so that when I go away, the breakthrough goes away. The biggest myth of all is that the world can then go back to the way it was. And every time there's a breakthrough, the world never really goes back to the way it was. So the fact is, we have huge teams of collaborative scientists slaving away together. It's us against the problem. And while we compete on sort of a one-off basis, I'm trying to beat my buddy to discover something specific, and we're certainly competing for funding. But at the end of the day, we're all working together towards these really big problems like climate change or AIDS or cancer or whatever it is we're working on. We're all working together towards this problem. And when we make an advance, the world stays changed forever. There's no putting the cat back in the bag. Next slide. So science fiction has changed our world. It is a reflection of the 20th century and how central science has been to our life, that so much of our fiction is actually science fiction, even when it's not called that. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is actually science fiction. Big Bang Theory is, in a way, science fiction. Almost all comic books, even G.I. Joe, is a real science fiction type of story. But it doesn't have a lot of the trappings of science fiction. So this continues to shape our world in a hidden and invisible way, because our stories create our myths. And our myths shape our perceptions, how we view the world, what information we're willing to take in and what information we're not willing to take in, is all based on this internal dialogue of story that we have going on. Science fiction has had a huge impact because science has had a huge impact. It's something that we think about because it's something that we care about. And it's something that we care about because it's something that affects us. Now, geeks read a lot of science fiction. And I'm putting a call out to all the geeks out there to help all those poor non-geeks. And all you non-geeks, go out and make friends with a geek. And when you have a question like, are the computers going to take over soon? Ask those geeky friends who read the science fiction so they can tell you, no, the computers aren't taking over anytime soon. But let's keep enjoying our science fiction.
Awesome. Wow. You heard it here, you guys. Thank you so much. That was so informative. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess science fiction is a way to take a look into the future, everybody.